5 times the Justice Department failed its citizen. At least 186 people wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death in the United States have been exonerated since 1973. But these figures are only the tip of the iceberg of the unlawful use of the death penalty. More than half of the false convictions are due to witnesses who lied in court or made false accusations. Other major causes of false convictions include false eyewitness identifications, misleading forensic science, and prison informants. An innocent being failed by justice is one of the most painful and disturbing things. In this video, we will discuss 5 such cases where the Justice Department failed its citizens badly. Let's begin. Isaiah Andrews conviction 1974. Isaiah Andrews and his wife, Regina Andrews, were newlyweds when, according to court records, he reported her missing from the Cleveland hotel room where they had lived while they were looking for a permanent home. On September 18, 1974, Andrews informed the detectives that he had last seen his wife shortly before 8 a.m. that day and that he had been running errands well into the evening. The body of Regina Andrews was found that afternoon in Forest Hill Park by a worker on his lunch break. She had been stabbed several times and wrapped in bed linen. At the time of the murder, detectives wrote that they thought the crime had been committed by Willie H. Watts, who was trying to sell his mother's valuables to escape the city. He was arrested, but his name was not mentioned in the trial, and there was no indication that he was mentioned in the suspects of the case. Detectives presented no physical evidence linking Isaiah Andrews to his wife's murder, and police found no blood in his car or hotel room, but he was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1975. He had previously spent 15 years in prison against charges of murder of his staff sergeant in the Marines. Investigators released Willie Watts after he successfully provided an alibi at the time of death. Later, Willie Watts was charged 4 times with kidnapping and imprisoned for more than 20 years for aggravated arson. However, the 2 kidnapping cases were dismissed later. However, he reportedly died in 2011. The Ohio Innocence Project, which aims to get wrongfully convicted people out of prison, knew nothing about Willie Watts when it decided to review Isaiah Andrews' case in 2015. These details became available in 2019 after Andrews' lawyers requested that the DNA should be tested in the case. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation requested files from the original medical examination and obtained police files that brought the other man's arrest to light. A Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court judge overturned Isaiah Andrews' conviction in 2020 and ordered a new trial. Andrews' lawyers said that the retrial was unnecessary and that they were surprised that Cuyahoga County prosecutors decided to continue the trial instead of rejecting the charges. At the second trial in October 1975, the main procedure consisted of reading minutes of the first trial in March 1975. The jury found Isaiah Andrews not guilty and finally exonerated him after 45 years. The unlawful detention of Andrews is considered the 3rd longest known in the United States. His unlawful detention declaration allows Andrews to proceed with a lawsuit seeking damages from the state. Andrews also filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the city of Cleveland, accusing the local police of failing to provide information about the other suspect. However, the money cannot make up for the years Isaiah Andrews spent in prison, and we all should strongly condemn such wrongful convictions. Kevin Strickland conviction 1979. In November 2021, Kevin Strickland was exonerated after more than 43 years in prison, making his case the longest confirmed conviction case in Missouri history and one of the longest-running convictions of its kind in the nation's history. Strickland was convicted of the murders of 22-year-old Sherry Black, 21-year-old Larry Ingram, and 20-year-old John Walker in 1978. Though no physical evidence linked him to the crime scene, family members provided an alibi, and the licensed killers said he was not there. The case was based on the testimony of Cynthia Douglas, the sole survivor and eyewitness, who later tried several times to retract her testimony because she said she had been pressured by the police. The executive director of the Midwest Innocence Project, Tricia Rojo Bushnell, said the Strickland case was a great example of how much a system cares about finality over fairness. It is disturbing to know that while most legal experts and elected officials supported Strickland's case for exoneration, top Republicans in Missouri were against it. Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt said he believed Strickland committed the killings. Andrew Clark, a deputy attorney general, argued that Strickland not only received a fair trial in 1979, but also worked for decades to evade responsibility. It was Cynthia Douglas who for years repeatedly tried to alert political and legal experts to help her prove she had identified the wrong man before her death in 2015. The judge also couldn't ignore the fact that two other men convicted in the murders were insisting that Strickland was not involved in the crime. All of this led to Strickland's exoneration. He can now fulfill his greatest wish to go for a walk by the ocean. William Jackson Marion wrongful conviction. In May 1872, William Jackson left Marion and John Cameron, two friends from Kansas, Liberty, Nebraska, and set out to work for the railroad. On 5 May 1872, Marion returned with Cameron's team of horses to his mother-in-law's house near Liberty. His mother-in-law suspected him of killing Cameron. Marion eventually left Nebraska. In March 1873, a body was found in a river in Gage County, Nebraska, wearing clothes that unknown witnesses claimed belonged to John Cameron. Marion was named as a suspect, although he could not be found. In December 1882, Marion was in the county jail of Sedan, Kansas, in Chautauqua County, awaiting trial for theft. He was taken to Beatrice, Nebraska, where he was charged with the murder of John Cameron. He was convicted by a jury, and the judge finally sentenced him to death in a process that lasted 2 months. On appeal, the Nebraska Supreme Court overturned the conviction and ordered a new trial, noting that under Nebraska law, at the time of the murder, a death sentence had to be handed down by a jury, not a judge. Marion was convicted for a second time, and again he was sentenced to death. After losing a second appeal, he was eventually hanged on 25 March 1887 in Beatrice, Nebraska. He was found completely guilty, and no one had any idea of his innocence. 4 years after Marion's execution in 1891, John Cameron showed up alive and declared that he had traveled to Mexico, Alaska, and Colorado in the nearly 20 years since his assassination. In a written statement from Marion's uncle William Waymore, Cameron said he had fled fearing paternity charges. John Cameron said he sold his team of horses to Marion and still has the note Marion gave him for payment of the balance. Well, Marion was no longer to pay for it. Marion was posthumously pardoned on 25 March 1987 by the state of Nebraska on the 100th anniversary of his wrongful hanging. Anthony Ray Hinton conviction 1985. In 1985, 2 fast food restaurants around Birmingham were robbed and managers John Davidson and Thomas Wayne Vason were fatally shot. There were no eyewitnesses or fingerprints. The police had no suspects and pressure to solve the killings grew as similar crimes continued. On 25 July 1985, a restaurant in Bessemer was robbed and the manager was shot, but not seriously injured. How did Anthony Hinton got involved? He was arrested after the injured manager identified him from a photo lineup. The poor guy was working in a warehouse 15 miles away at the time of the crime and had no clue about it. Police seized an old revolver belonging to Hinton's mother, and state gun inspectors said it was the gun used in all 3 crimes. The prosecutor, who had a documented history of racial prejudice, said he could recognize Anthony Hinton as guilty and evil simply because of his appearance. He told the court that the match between Mrs. Hinton's gun and the bullets from all 3 crimes alleged by state experts was the only solid evidence that was linking Hinton to the killings of Davidson and Vason. 29-year-old Anthony Hinton had no history of violent crime and steadfastly maintained his innocence. A lie detector test conducted by the police exonerated him, but the judge refused to admit it in court. Mr. Hinton was appointed as a lawyer who mistakenly thought he could not raise enough money to hire a qualified weapons inspector. Instead, he hired a visually impaired civil engineer with no experience in identifying firearms, who admitted he could not operate the machinery needed to examine the evidence. Since there was no credible expert who could challenge the state's claim of congruency, Hinton was finally declared guilty and sentenced to death. In 2014, the Supreme Court unanimously overturned his conviction due to poor representation of his attorney, and Jefferson County District Court Judge Laura Petro ordered a new trial. The state's evidence of a match was completely discredited by 3 highly skilled firearms examiners, including the former head of the FBI's Firearms and Tool Brands Division, who testified in 2002 that the bullets from all 3 crimes could not be attributed to a single weapon at all, let alone Mrs. Hinton's gun. They determined that their weapon could not have fired the bullets of the 3rd unloaded robbery. For more than 15 years, EGI lawyers repeatedly asked state officials to reconsider the evidence in this case, but former Jefferson County District Attorney David Barber and attorneys general from Troy King to Lutherstrange all did not. Finally, on April 3, 2015, Anthony Hinton left the Jefferson County Prison in Birmingham, Alabama for the first time in 30 years as a free man. Devonia Inman Conviction 2001. Devonia Inman was sentenced to life imprisonment in a murder trial in which Georgia prosecutors hid exculpatory evidence. He was convicted in 2001 in a trial to the death penalty for the robbery and murder on September 19, 1998, in the restaurant parking lot of the manager of a Taco Bell in Adel, Georgia. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, although a distinctive homemade ski mask was recovered from the victim's stolen car, which prosecutors said belonged to the killer. Later, the mask helped in the identification of the killer, Hercules Brown, a former employee at Taco Bell, by DNA tests. Prosecutors presented 4 key witnesses against Devonia Inman, 3 of whom later recanted their testimony, saying they had been pressured by police. These included an alleged prison informant who falsely testified that Inman confessed to the murder, and a woman who described herself as a friend of Inman and claimed that she saw Inman with money on the morning of the day after the robbery. The 4th witness against Inman received a $5,000 payment for her testimony and claimed to have seen Inman driving the victim's car. However, a man who was next to her at the time testified that it was too dark for anyone to identify the driver. Even though several witnesses told the defense that Brown had admitted to committing the murder, he did nothing about it. However, when Inman's lawyers tried to bring them to justice, Judge Buster McConnell forbade them to testify. With the ski mask in his possession and the knowledge that Inman argued in court that Brown was the murderer, defense prosecutors held evidence that police had found another homemade ski mask in Brown's car when he was arrested on drug and gun charges in front of a Nobility supermarket in September 2000. Brown was also charged with murdering 2 other people during another armed robbery in a Noble grocery store, arrested months after Taco Bell's murder, and pleaded guilty. Prosecutors and courts repeatedly delayed Inman's exoneration, despite overwhelming evidence of his innocence. On December 20, 2021, a month after Judge Christina Cook granted Graham Inman a new trial based on evidence that prosecutors had unconstitutionally suppressed multiple police files and physical evidence that another man had committed the murder, Chase L. Studstill requested that all charges against Inman be dismissed. Clayton Tomlinson, Chief Justice of the Alapaha Circuit Superior Court, granted the request, exonerated Inman, and ordered his immediate release 23 years after his wrongful conviction. The strength of a justice system depends on its ability to convict the guilty and clear the innocent. However, we still witness so many false convictions. Recognizing and understanding the causes of wrongful convictions is critical to maintaining the integrity of a justice system. Hopefully, things in the judicial system will change for the better. So, let's wind up this video here. Don't forget to comment down your take on these wrongful convictions below. Subscribe to the channel for more similar videos and hit the bell icon to stay up to date each time we reveal a new shocking case. Until next time, stay safe.